Today I am going to be talking about major diseases of wild salmon and spread from salmon farms. We talked a lot about sea lice this morning, and I recognized from the concerns from one of the participants that they were really interested in some other diseases besides sea lice. So I hopefully I will be able to cover it to their satisfaction. So let's start. So these are just the key points that I was asked to address by the steering committee for this meeting. So there's 5 points, including overview of the major diseases, fish health on salmon farms, and disease outbreaks with comparison of all the areas and just the Kitasoo Klemtu area. We were going to address the elephant in the house, the PRV HSMI issue in British Columbia. I will address a little bit on sea lice treatments and how to manage resistance. And finally, what your community, a suggestion of what your community could do in monitoring wild fish and farm fish to ensure that there is a sustainability of both resources. So just a quick little a point on what happens when anyone, including salmon, are exposed to an infectious agent. We've all lived through COVID, so we're pretty familiar about the whole idea that you can be exposed and not become infected. So some of the key points are that not all infectious agents cause disease in all species that are exposed. And even within the species that might be sensitive, it might be very specific life stages that are specifically sensitive to a disease. Think about your childhood type diseases that, adults may be exposed to certain viruses and pathogens and not get sick, but if your children got exposed, they would get sick. The other thing is detecting an infectious agent. And this is fairly important, does not automatically mean disease is present. If somebody went and swabbed the whole community and checked for certain bacteria or viruses, probably a large percentage of the population might actually be positive, but they are not diseased. So they may have the infection, but they do not have disease. And when it comes to diseases that we're commonly seeing on salmon farms in British Columbia, the diseases are indigenous. So the diseases, for the most part, have had a history within the wild population. So it's not that diseases have been introduced. So let's just look at this table here. So an animal gets exposed to an infectious agent. So in some cases, nothing happens. Basically, you lose the agent. And that's just a matter of the fish having a super great immune system or not even being susceptible. Another case, the host or the fish might become infected. If they do become infected, there are a couple of different directions it could go. If they could just clear the infection, so they don't really get disease, their immune system again is strong enough to fight off the infection, or they may get clinical disease, or they may get no clinical disease, sort of a subclinical disease where there might be some microscopic changes, but there isn't really a obvious expression of disease. From there, we could get, if they develop clinical disease, you might get severe disease, you might get mortality. You might actually get a latent infection, which could cause mortality, or they may recover and develop immunity, or they may even become a carrier state. Even if the fish or anything gets infected and they don't exhibit clinical disease, they may become carriers, or they may recover but still be susceptible. So those are just the different processes that could happen when you get exposed to an infectious agent. So again, not all infectious agents cause disease in all species, and a detection of an infectious agent does not automatically mean disease. So I am not an artist, but this is my rendition of a fish farm, and showing that fish farm, or they're contained within a net pen. And there's usually two different types of populations that may be exposed to fish farms. There's the resident populations, the fish that tend to either use the fish farm as a source of protection, like a refuge, or they're just attracted to the lights or the feed, just like fish are attracted to jetties or docks. They get it's a source of protection. So sometimes the fish are outside the pen. Some of the smaller fish might swim into the pens, but these are sort of the resident populations. And then the other populations are the migrating populations. They might swim past the farms at some point in their travels to or from the feeding grounds. And a lot of, in our situation, we can say it's the Pacific salmon population. So the salmon that are emerging from the rivers as basically smolts, or if they're pink and chum, just very small fish, swim past the farm, spend a little bit of time on their way out to the feeding grounds. When they come back as adults, they may go past the farms again. So when we talk about movement of infectious agents between fish farms and wild populations, probably the most common routes of spread is either through the water. So the pathogen goes into the water, and then basically the water carries the pathogen to a fish, or it's direct fish-to-fish contact. The fish actually have to be in very close proximity to each other. And the theory about that's often sort of presented is that farms are amplifiers of pathogens. So basically what you get is, as I said before, a lot of the diseases, or most of the diseases that we see in British Columbia are indigenous to this coast. So what you have is an infected population either swimming by or being resident, and you get the pathogens being transmitted from a sick fish into a net pen. And that's called spillover. So what happens after that is the amplification. Because the fish farm fish tend to be in a sort of a closed contained, they tend to be in a larger population. The theory is that the bacteria then starts, or the virus starts to amplify. It becomes like a soup. And so you get more and more development of the pathogen if the fish are susceptible. And you can see here from being healthy fish to more and more diseased fish, and you get more cycling of the virus or the bacteria. And then what happens is then you get another population of fish that swim by, and they are, if they're susceptible, they'll get exposed to these agents and become infected, and that's called spillback. Now, amplification is something that we try to control, or aquaculture tries to control in various number of ways, because really you don't want this process to occur. So some of the way farms avoid amplification of infectious agents is by sighting, and that's to avoid risks. So you tend to try, if you know that there's an area where there's a certain disease that seems to be prevalent in the resident population, you don't want to set up a farm there. If you have, you don't necessarily want to set up a farm in an area of a really known intense migratory route of a population of fish, if you're concerned that those fish might actually be may be infected or could infect your population. So sighting is a very important element, and a lot of research is done in trying to find the right sites. There are certainly examples within aquaculture where sites were established even within your community that were found not to be optimal, and the farms were taken out and moved elsewhere to find better siting locations. Another important method of preventing amplification or preventing disease is through broodstock screening. So in aquaculture, the broodstock come from the population of salmon that are raised in the farms. In some situations, they come from net pens. In some situations, they're actually raised their entire time in a hatchery type setting. Regardless of where they are raised, there are certain diseases that are transmitted, are potentially transmitted from the parent to the offspring, and that's called vertical transmission. So in British Columbia, there are 2 diseases that have the potential of being transmitted from parent to offspring. One of them is a bacteria, and it's bacterial kidney disease. Any of you guys that have actually worked in any of the enhancement hatcheries are probably quite familiar with bacterial kidney diseases. It causes like a gray granulomatous, like gray chunky appearance in the kidney, and it kills fish quite readily. The other disease that is potentially vertically transmitted is IHN, which is infectious hematopoietic necrosis virus. It's one of the most common diseases that you see in sockeye salmon. So in aquaculture, to prevent vertical transmission, so from parent to offspring, each broodstock is actually sampled and tested for these diseases. And if they're found positive, those eggs are discarded. Now, the final one that we're going to discuss today in preventing disease, so therefore preventing any kind of amplification, is vaccination. In British Columbia, all the salmon, be it Atlantic or Chinook or coho, that are moved from freshwater to the marine sites are vaccinated against diseases that they may face in the marine environment. The fish are actually vaccinated individually. So you can see this is a table. This is the vaccine here, and these guys are basically vaccinating or injecting these fish. The most common method for vaccinating is giving the fish an injection into the abdomen. So basically that's called intraperitoneal injection. Most of the vaccines that are provided in fish are provided in this method. The other method is IM injection. So this fish is also, these fish are anesthetized. They're put into an anesthetic bath, sort of put to sleep so that they don't feel pain, and then they are allowed to recover. This fish here is given an IM, intramuscular injection. And again, most of you guys are familiar. Intramuscular is often done in the arms of us, but here it's done on sort of the dorsal area of the fish. In this situation, it's actually a vaccine for IHN. And it's a very effective vaccine. So what happens is about 1 to 2 months prior to saltwater entry, when the fish are still par, not quite smoltified, they are vaccinated and then allowed to have their immune system develop a protection, and then before they enter the sea environment. So first question that was actually presented to me is to sort of talk about the major salmon diseases and if there's vaccines available for these diseases in the farm fish. So to find the diseases that might be a concern in wild fish, I went to this paper here that was published in 2019 by some colleagues of mine, where they did a literature review, both published literature as well as gray literature. So that's reports, any kind of lab results, looking for diseases that have been, or let me correct, infectious agents that have been found in wild populations that may also have, for diseases that may also be a problem in farm fish. So ultimately they had a huge list, but it came down to these 3 viruses and these 6 bacterium, where there seems to be some kind of extensive work in wild population surveillance to see that the infection is actually present. So IHNV is, again, infectious hematopoietic necrosis virus. It's Most commonly, it's been detected in sockeye salmon. There's been a few reports in Chinook salmon, none in chum coho or pink or steelhead, but it is really known to be a disease of sockeye salmon. It's also known to have caused significant mortalities in farmed Atlantic salmon. There was an outbreak that affected multiple farms in the 90s, and then again in 2001 and 3. After the 2001 outbreak, there was a really concerted effort to develop an effective vaccine. And basically, it was developed. It's the one that's IM. Initially, it was mostly fish that were vaccinated were the fish that were going into the Discovery Passage areas, the ones around Campbell River, because that was the area where most of the disease outbreaks occurred. There was also a disease outbreak actually in Klemtu in 2002. And then in 2012, there was a minor outbreak, but they saw that this vaccine was very effective. So what's now happened, it's completely industry-wise. All Atlantic salmon that are entered into any of the regions in BC receive this vaccine. The next virus that they were able to find, that there was actually some literature in of finding the occurrence of this virus in wild fish, was VHSV. That's viral hemorrhagic septicemia virus, and it's mostly a herring disease. You can sometimes find it on farm salmon. It's not a big disease of concern in farm salmon, and it's definitely not a disease of wild salmon. There is no vaccine currently available for this. PRV, Piscine reovirus. I believe that was the virus that the gentleman was asking about earlier, just before lunch. It has been found in all species of wild Pacific salmon, but there has not been any disease associated with it. The prevalence or the detection level within BC has been estimated to be about 4.7% of the fish that they examined, which incidentally is very similar to the levels that of the detection of the same virus in Washington State and Alaska, which is about 3.4%. Both these detection levels in these wild populations is considerably lower than what has been detected in wild salmon in Norway, where this virus has been implicated in causing a disease called HSMI. There is no vaccine available. In British Columbia, this virus has also been found in farm fish, both Atlantic and Pacific salmon, but the disease that they see in Norway has not been detected. So these 6 bacteria were also quite commonly detected within this paper. So Aeromonas salmonicida, it's the causative agent of frunculosis, and it's been detected in trout in the wild, as well in low levels in Chinook, coho, and sockeye. It hasn't really been detected in pink and chum salmon. It has been known to cause disease. It's called frunculosis, as I said. It has also been known to cause disease in farm fish. There's a very effective vaccine against that one. Renibacterium salmonarium, we did talk about that as being one of those diseases that they are managed through broodstock testing. So Renibacterium, it causes bacterial kidney disease. It has been detected in all species of wild Pacific salmon, including Chinook, coho, and sockeye. Pretty low detection in pinks and chum. There is a vaccine for it, although I think the screening processes that are in place is probably a better way of trying to prevent this disease. Piscirickettsia is another bacterial disease. It has been bacterial pathogen causes Piscirickettsia SRS. and it has been detected in Chinook, coho, pink, and sockeye, but it's never really, you haven't seen too much disease associated with it in the wild populations, though we do see it on the farms. There is a vaccine. Yersinia ruceri tends to be more of a freshwater bacteria. It causes enteric red mouth. It's been seen mostly in sockeye and steelhead. It has been shown to cause diseases in these species. There is a vaccine available for it. Moritella viscosa, there's been a single detection of it using the fluidime, but there hasn't really been any kind of disease associated with it in wild fish. There is a vaccine available. I don't know how effective it is. And then finally, Tenacibaculum maritimum. It's a causative agent of a disease that we see in Atlantic salmon called mouth rot or yellow mouth. It's also being detected in sockeye using the fluidime. Again, there hasn't been any kind of disease associated with it in the wild fish. Currently, there is no vaccine available for this. So this is just, I wanted to show you, this is mouth rot. Again, it's caused by Tenacibaculum, a bacteria. And often what you see is simply this yellow plaque in the smolt's jaw, and you get some ulcerations. So you can see it's fairly minor, but it can kill the fish. What I usually call it like a childhood disease, because what happens is that you see it shortly after the fish have been entered in seawater, and then it disappears after the fish are about 400 to 500 grams. There is no treatment. There is no vaccine, but we do treat it with antibiotics. And it seems to be very associated with high salinity. So as you know, with salmon farming, fish go from a hatchery, so they go from a freshwater environment directly into these net pens. These net pens can be fairly high salinity. So they miss that transition that a lot of wild fish go through, going up a river into an estuary and then slowly increasing the salinity. So there's that jump from 0 to 32 parts per thousand, which probably is a bit of a shock to their system, and then they just they get this infection and it causes this disease. So I was asked on how common, what are the diseases that we see on salmon farms, and how common are disease outbreaks? I haven't been working in the BC industry for a few years, so I thought, well, let's take advantage of all the public reporting that's been collected by DFO since they've taken over the management of aquaculture. So I went into the Open Canada database, and I went into looking for fish health events. Fish health events are fish health situations where a veterinarian makes a diagnosis and makes a decision that some kind of management has to occur, be it treatment or some other process. So this table here is basically all the fish health events that have happened since 2016 to 2022. 2022 obviously being an incomplete year. But what you can see here is that of the infectious diseases, the predominant one that we see in the industry is mouth rot, the one that's caused by that Tenacibaculum. And the other one, the second most common one is SRS, which is the Piscirachetsia. But that's quite a bit less frequent than this one. The other interesting thing that this table showed me is that really over the last 6 years, there really hasn't really been that much of a change in fish health events. So it's not like the fish are getting sicker and that there's more diagnosis and more treatments. So it's been fairly steady. Now, if we just look at the Kitasoo, the Klemtu region, again, it's mouth rot. Mouth rot is the predominant disease. The other one was skin ulceration. So very little disease up in the Kitasoo area. And again, very little change over time. So that was industry reporting. So I thought, okay, well, let's look at what the audit reports are, because the audit reports are where the DFO fish health people go out to farms and they verify that the farms are actually reporting what's going on the farms with relation to disease. So again, this is the industry level, and this is the Central Coast Kitasoo area. So what you can see here, that mouth rot as an infectious agent was probably, again, the most commonly detected disease or diagnosis at a farm level. But interestingly, most of the audit farms had no significant disease at the time of audit. So there was no issue going on the farm. The other fairly frequent event was some kind of environmental insult, being low DO or plankton. Again, if we look at the Kitasoo, Klemtu area, mouth rot again was, if you looked at infectious diseases, it's the most common one detected, but really the most common finding on these audits is that there's no disease on the farms. And again, you can see there really isn't much change over time. So when you look at what is causing mortality on the farms, again, I went to a different database, and this one is mortality events. So this is large scale mortality where you actually lose a large number of fish on a very short period of time. You know, in certain situations, the worst case scenario, it might be a disease. But if you can see what in the industry, like the entire industry, it's mostly low DO and plankton blooms. Those are the major killers. So environmental influences. Dick Beamish talked about the blob that caused a large mortality back in 2015, 2016. So that, and then algal blooms, that tends to be, there's heterosigma, Kitasoo, those are all sort of blooms that, because the fish are in these tanks, these nets, they can't escape, whereas wild fish can swim away and find better quality water. But the interesting other thing is that there's this treatment that is also a probable cause. The treatment, as I will talk a little bit later, is really associated with sea lice treatments. So that's for the entire industry. And if you again look at the Kitasoo, it's really no different. Algal bloom, low DO, and treatments are sort of the main reasons for any kind of large scale mortalities that we might see on the farms. So the next point I wanted to talk to you about is PRV or HSMI. The source, its spread, and the risk to farm and wild salmon. So Hycine orthovirus is a causative agent for disease called heart and skeletal muscle inflammation, or HSMI. And it's found, this disease is predominantly found and diagnosed in Norway. It's actually one of the most common diseases diagnosed in Norway. This virus is quite ubiquitous in the farmed fish in Norway. It's found in quite a large percentage of the fish, but not all of them exhibit HSMI. When you look at the wild fish, the wild Atlantic salmon, quite a large percentage of them also have been detected with this virus, this PRV, but they have no disease. So disease in the farmed with the virus, but no disease in the wild with the virus. So the British Columbia situation is that this disease also has been found on farm fish, but no disease. HSMI is being described as causing morbidity, sort of slow swimming, elevated mortalities. It has quite distinctive lesions or clinical presentation. The fish are slow swimming. They may have fluid in their belly. So there are distinct clinical signs and presentation, as well as overall mortality, morbidity profiles with the disease, and it's not seen in BC. The virus is also being seen in the Pacific salmon, as I said earlier in the presentation, and the prevalence within all the species between 3 to 5% across the board from Alaska down to Washington State, and again, no disease. So why the difference? It's been suggested that it might be a different strain So in Norway, it's a genotype 1, whereas in BC, it's a genotype 1A. That's quite possible. It's also been suggested that this disease, this presentation of HSMI, is the result of this virus, as well as other risk factors such as handling, increased handling or stress in sort of the Norwegian aquaculture setting. As Crawford talked about, the thresholds for sea lice are very low. So they're doing a lot of fish handling to try to maintain those low levels of sea lice. So that could be an explanation of why they have the disease and we don't. So again, this is another figure that you saw. This is again taken from the website showing sea lice treatments on salmon farms. So now we've talked about infectious disease. Now we're talking about sea lice. And we're just, I was asked to talk a little bit about resistance. So you can see what's happened over the period between 2011 and to 2022 is that in general, except for 2015 and 13, during the out-migration period, the levels have been quite low on the salmon farms, below the threshold. In the period between 2000 and 2010, there was variability in the sea lice levels on the farms too, and they tended to be quite low. I published a report with Crawford and Larry Greba on this back in 2010, I believe. But you can see in general, high levels in the sort of late summer, fall with the return of the salmon, and then low levels, sort of indicating that management has been pretty good for sea lice in this region. But what's happened is which I find quite interesting, is that prior to 2014, most of the treatments experienced in aquaculture across BC has been predominantly in feed. But starting in 2015, you basically started seeing these medicinal bath treatments, and that's hydrogen peroxide. And then basically starting about 2018-19, you started seeing this huge increase in non-medical bath treatments. And those are basically pumping the fish and exposing them to water pressure called a hydrolyser to try to knock the lice off the fish. So you could see what's happened is that there's maybe a bit of a decrease in the in-feed and an increase in other methods of treatments. Both of these methods, both the medicinal and the mechanical, actually involve lots of handling of fish. As a result, and I found this quite interesting, and again, this is again taken from the data from DFO, is that if you look at 2016, where there was basically a little bit of hydrogen peroxide, but no mechanical, about 6% of the mortalities, so the mortality events, large mortalities, were associated with large-scale mortality. So mechanical basically was 6% of the events that were causing kind of large-scale mortality. Jump to 2021, it's now 60%. So this indicates to me that there's a problem with these mechanical treatments, be it hydrogen peroxide or the treatment of lice, because it's actually causing, it may be effective at getting rid of lice, but it's also causing problems in the population and causing mortalities. So when you're looking at managing sea lice, there are certain steps in trying to figure out the best way to manage it. And there's certain key elements that are involved in effectively managing any kind of ectoparasite. And it's called an integrated pest management protocol. So basically, there's several elements. So there's veterinary oversight. It's really important to have people to understand. And when I talk about veterinary oversight, it also means having the proper biologists involved, like Simon Jones. He's the expert of sea lice. He can totally explain a lot of issues that as vets, because we're generalists, may not really understand. it's important to have regular monitoring programs and reporting. And Crawford did a really nice job of dissing my research, but he didn't, because what he did was he showed that based on what the data we had at the time when we published our work, the correlations seemed to be pretty strong, but by adding or collecting more information, you could see that that was maybe not really what was going on. So the idea of building a wealth of knowledge over time is hugely important in trying to understand any dynamic process, be it disease or what's going on in the environment. And then Dick Beamish talking about all the stuff that's going on with the wild salmon return. If you only looked at a couple of years, you wouldn't really see any kind of trend, but seeing what's going on over a large expanse of time, you actually can build a really good story and maybe develop a program and better understanding how to manage it. So when it comes to IPMs, so you've got regular monitoring, each one may want to coordinate treatments, you want to develop a strategy, you want to have use bioassays, which is developing sensitivity, to determine sensitivity. You want to maybe combine treatments using therapeutic, a therapeutic and a non-therapeutic method. You want to do monitoring, more monitoring, pre-treatment, post-treatment monitoring. You need some regulatory oversight. I think BC has done a wonderful job in transparency and collecting data. And based on what I was saying before, and this is a big issue, is that we need to figure out how to reduce those handling mortalities so we don't have a large number of mechanical related mortalities. So the last point I want to bring up is, it was something that was asked, is what can the Kitasoo do to monitor diseases in wild populations and basically try to mitigate risks? And bottom line is, I think what we need to do is look at the picture holistically. So there's the wild and farm, but it's a whole ecosystem. And what we need to be doing is working towards adaptive management to try to figure out a best way forward. And I think the Kitasoo is, you are the major stakeholder. You need to have community engagement, and you need to be involved in developing, implementing, assessing any of the plans as equal partners. So that's it.